online, so that's recorded for anyone who wants to catch it or for anyone who misses it. It's always at youtube.com/TSB live. You can always catch any classes you missed there. The goal will be to do this in 8 classes, we'll see. So the bracha for Torah study is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam habereket shanu
Amen.
Amen, amen, amen. And we'll let me please feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions, comments, anything like that along the way, and we'll drop in. So it took us, I think, 9 weeks to do the 4 chapters of the book of Ruth. So I want to do 10 chapters of Esther in 8 weeks. So that means a slightly different pace, but it might be possible. If you remember, if you've done other things like that when we studied together, Ruth has had a lot of like halachic ins and outs and things like that, where we were where we had to do background on levirate marriage, what happens when a couple dies childless, or the status of Moabites, or the status of or the background Boaz's ancestry with Peretz, who is the child of Yehuda and Tamar. All of these things. That's less necessary with Esther. Esther's a totally different book. And so we read it through, comparatively quickly on Purim, and we're getting through it. And we often will do a spiel with it, which mocks it, and rightly so. It is, it's a farce, I think. This is, we always try to read these books both with a pious mind on one hand and a skeptical mind on the other, and I think that that's a good approach for this as well. Again, like, that's part of relevant to our current situation, how you approach things productively, meaning that understanding different perspectives or different ways of taking in information is part of how you have to live in the world, and that's part of how we approach these texts. And again, not doing that is what leads to the sort of madness that we see in our country. So that Esther famously is a few things that we all that's always important to keep in mind. One, many of you know, it's the only book in the Tanakh that never mentioned God's name. God is occasionally referred to obliquely, but it never says God's name. So of all the 37 books of the Tanakh, God's name is not mentioned, which makes it, to some people, an odd inclusion in the Bible. It takes place entirely outside of the land of Israel, and outside of a passing reference to the land of Israel, like it's not really, Israel isn't really mentioned. It's never said that the characters pray, meaning they fast, but it never says that they pray to God. Esther gets intermarried. In fact, like, that's sort of like the part of the driver of the plot is that the Jewish heroine is married to a non-Jewish man. Nobody knows she's Jewish, and she's living in the palace, which sort of like, which brings up these questions of like, wait a minute, what she's eating? I don't know. Like, I caught the tail end of this conversation that was having beforehand about, like, differences in Jewish communities, especially in the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox community. And it's like, look, if you, as many of you know, if you have a observant Jew staying with you, an ultra-Orthodox Jew staying with you, it doesn't take you, there can't be Esther's living in the palace for years, like without anyone knowing she's Jewish. Like, how can that be? You know, in a couple hours, by the time mealtime shows up, that you have a Jew living with you, much less by the time, Friday night rolls around. So the fact that she's living in the palace and nobody knows she's Jewish, I mean, one doesn't make sense because everyone knows that she's related to Mordecai, it seems, but like uh, but but there's a lack of piety in these characters. That's amazing. And it's sort of, and what we'll get to over the course of it, the book seems to be uh, overtly sexual and very bawdy, and that also sort of puts it outside of like normative Jewish thought. So like those things, it's a total outlier. And then the historical note on it is that of all of the 37 books of the Tanakh, it is the only one for which we don't have any fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, meaning that it's that there's at least a fragment of every other book of the Bible of the Hebrew Bible in the in Qumran, found with the Dead Sea Scrolls, except for Esther. Now, with archaeology, that can just mean that's an accident. Maybe they had lots of copies of it, but like somehow they just all got destroyed, by over the course of time, though, which is certainly a possibility. Or because of all the above mentioned things, it suggests that maybe their version of the Tanakh, their version of the Bible, didn't have Esther in it, because it doesn't mention God, because because the people don't seem all that pious, because it's sort of sexy, and the Book of Esther serves as an etiology. That's our fancy SAT word for a story that explains the origin of something. It's an etiology for Purim. Why do we have this holiday? Because of this story, right? Just like we have in the, Jacob wrestles with an angel in the Torah, and then at the end of it, and at the end of it, Jacob is injured by the angel who hits his sciatic nerve, and it says that, and then the narrator of the Torah comes in and says, this is why Jews don't eat the sciatic nerve in any animal to this day. It's like, it sort of explains this little piece of this story is an etiological story. It explains why this little piece of kashrut exists. The Esther is that for Purim, right? It explains why Purim exists. I'll pause for a second. I just threw a lot out there and see if people have questions or comments I want to throw in here.
Yes, you used the term marriage. This wasn't really a marriage. She was a harem girl, which is just a bunch of women there to serve at the pleasure of the king.
She seems to be the primary wife, meaning that she begins or like she starts out, in the king's service. Esther does in the harem, but then she's the queen, and it's pretty clear that she's the queen. They say she's the queen, and she seems to be. He has a harem. And a wife. And just like Vashti is the queen and his wife, despite the existence of a harem, presumably in the first chapter, after, from the end of the second chapter into the third, Esther has been elevated from the harem to being wife and queen.
But she couldn't even go to him without on the pain of death.
Correct. Such is the marriage, but I think it's worth keeping that perspective in mind as we go through. She, I think as we read through it, we can see if there's evidence otherwise. Like for marriage, she's not a mere harem girl. After chapter 2, she's elevated. She's wife. She's queen. She still is, which is yeah. So that. Any others? So then a couple of notes then on date. The usually is the other part. I love the Book of Ruth, and I think that came through. I also have a deep love of the Book of Esther. the after this we'll do Daniel, which I'm totally unfamiliar with, and is very obscure. So, but part of what's the upside downness of Esther, and Esther's all about the book meaning is all about turning things upside down, is that usually with books of the Tanakh, we uh, we sorry the scholarly dating of the book is much later than the traditional dating of the book, meaning that the traditional version of when the Torah is written is in the time of Moses. The scholarly opinion of it is it comes together into its current form like around the time of the Babylonian exile, right? Like it's the time of Ezra may even be the redactor, or one of Jeremiah's scribes may be the redactor of the Torah, right? Like so, usually that's the way it works. The stories of David begin early, or are attributed to Samuel for much of the tradition, or many of the David stories are attributed to Samuel. But like but scholars put the timing of when that book came into being much later. It's sort of reversed with Esther, which is perfect for Esther because Esther is a story of reversals, right? Like Haman, who builds a gallows for Mordecai, but Mordecai family arranges for Haman to be hung on those gallows, or to be hanged, or impaled on that stake, whichever it is. Haman thinks that he's going to be honored by the king, but it's Mordecai who's honored by the king, right? It's all about reversals. The Jews are supposed to be killed, but the Jews are the ones who do the killing, right? It's all about reversals. So here too, there's a reversal in that the most scholars think, and you see this if Robert Alter's introduction will say that this seems to be 4th or 5th century BCE, 4th or 5th century BCE, early in the period of exile, partly because it seems that they don't mention even the return to Ezra's return, right? Like it seems like there doesn't seem, it knows the temple is destroyed, but it doesn't seem to reference the second temple, right? Like, so that's a pretty small window, right? So it seems to be somewhere back then. But the traditional read of it, Art Scroll E read of it, is that it's the last book written that's included in the Tanakh, meaning it places it later. So even that sort of functions as a reversal. And I will say here, especially sort of spiritually and theologically, I have a very soft spot for the traditional read, meaning that I really love the idea that if you read, I know Ellen's got it, like if you read the Art Scroll Tanakh and their introduction for it, they even say that this is the last book to be included. And yeah, so they say, what book could be more necessary for a nation in exile, a nation that would have to endure more exiles before the final redemption would come? So the book of Esther is the last one to be recorded, and one of the first that should come to mind when everything seems hopeless. So that sort of tradition that Esther is the last book to be included in the Tanakh is spiritually insightful because God's not mentioned, meaning that I like the arc of the story, the biography, as it were, of God, as pulling from Jack Miles' biography of God, that in the beginning, as it were, God is very present in the Israelites' lives, right? God visits Abraham when he's sick. God like a friend of the family, Jack Miles says, like sort of like helps out Joseph when he's in jail. This week, when the Israelites are in this week's Torah portion in Shemot, when the Israelites are oppressed by Pharaoh, God hears their cries and comes to their help. And then God will help them through the desert. And God is like a parent, helping them through hard times and telling them what to do. And in the book of Esther, God is not mentioned. There are no direct miracles. God is nowhere directly to be found. And it's the transition book of sort of like, not when the people of Israel were young, they needed a parent to tell them to put on their mittens and to help talk to their teachers and to get them out of trouble and to tell them like sort of like how to navigate through life. And then slowly they grow up, and God slowly pulls back, like a parent can pull back. And there's a certain point where now the people are grown up and they're going to still get into trouble. They're certainly have problems, but now you've got to figure out on your own. And that's the moment when Mordecai says to Esther, you're like, who knows, maybe you're the queen for just this kind of situation, for just this moment. And there's a sense of, oh, that people have. Now I'm a grown up. I can't call mom and dad and ask them for help anymore because now it's up to me. I'm on my own. And I love that image that it's sort of like, because that's the pivot point, because that's the world we're in. We know that if we have problems, and we do, God isn't going to zap down a solution. We have to pull on what we've learned from God to try and solve our problems. And that's what Mordecai and Esther do. And that's the pivot point. There's a transition between the biblical world, where God might just zap down a miracle and send a big fish to swallow Jonah and spit him back out onto land. Or give him a shade tree to help him out in his moment of distress, to our world where nobody's coming to the rescue except for us. So that's part of why I love the traditional view of Esther as the last biblical book.
Rabbi?
Yep.
This was written when the Jews were in exile. And with everything you said, could it not be that that's why at this point you need something that's bawdy and that's a farce and that would make you go out and have a, I don't know, carnival-like atmosphere? Could that not be the period where you need something like this?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of so the is it that things were bad and so they needed like a fun blow off steam holiday. Purim obviously is the exception to the rule on Jewish holidays. That the one is the only biblical holiday not mentioned in the Torah, right? If we have we have Hanukkah as well, not mentioned in the Tanakh, but none of the other biblical books sort of like assert a holiday, and maybe times are so bad that they needed one that was not so serious, and again all the themes of things being upside down and reversals being the case. That of course is the point of masking yourself. That you get to reverse. I act like this all the time, but I can put on a mask and drinking being another key theme, though sort of surprisingly and problematically in many ways, and become something else. So maybe they needed to blow off steam because times were bad.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
What you were saying before, and I think what Alter was also saying, is that in a sense, this could be looked at as a very modernist kind of book. But there's a critical difference in literature between absurdist and modernist. In one sense, I was looking at this as very existential, where God has abandoned them, you were talking about this idea of the parent and, and the abandonedness. So God can abandon us and we are on our own and we have to make our own decisions. That's very existential. But this is a farce and this is absurdist. And there is a definite difference between farce and absurdism and abandonment and existentialism. And one gives the utmost responsibility. It is a terror to be abandoned by God and to be on your own. That's existentialism. Absurdism is different. Absurdism is farce, okay? And that is actually different. And so I'm wondering if reading this as farce, which is ridiculousness, that doesn't work. In a modern sense, we have both. We have absurdism and we have existentialism. But which way are we going to read this? Because the abandonment of God and the abandonment of man is very different.
Right. So yeah. Thanks. So like there is a. I feel like I don't know if it's either of the two because it's.
I can't see it as an abandonment.
Right.
I can see it as an existential moment.
Because it's like it's not abandoned because there's a happy ending. So like the tradition, again, like if you're in the art school, right, like the tradition will read it as God hasn't abandoned. God is just behind the scenes, right, and manipulating things just less overtly than before. There's one aspect of the tradition says that whenever it refers to the Melech, just Melech Achashverosh, it's talking about the guy, the king. But when it says Ha-Melech, the king, it means that the king is at work. There's that there's a sense that God's working behind the scene, and that it's not. And this is like again the art school view, like that they have like that to the untrained eye, you think it's just a series of coincidences leading to a happy ending, but it is no such thing. It is not a series of coincidences. It's all part of the great plan. And that's why it has a happy ending. God hasn't abandoned you. God is just hidden behind the scenes, behind the curtain. And of course, the word for in the Torah, when God says, if you don't follow the mitzvot, I will hide my face. Hester panim. Hester and Esther, right? The word for hidden is the name of the protagonist, right? She's the protagonist. So if Esther is from the same root as hidden, then again, there's a root that God is hidden, but not absent, just not as visible as before. So it is. So some read it as a farce, but there's also this not farcical reading that sort of like reads it very seriously, but both happen at once. Meaning again, like think of Purim, and I think God willing, probably not this year, but in the future again, like. Purim done right, and I think it's often done right here, like is both serious. Reading this book that I think actually has serious themes for our time and for all time, and ridiculous and fun and silly, and it is both at once.
Rabbi?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a couple of things. First of all, Esther is not a Hebrew name. It's Astarte, the fertility goddess, and so it's a pagan name. Her name was Hadassah,
right?
And so that was one thing. Secondly, it says in the Jewish Study Bible that Ahasuerus is Xerxes the first, who's I think Cyrus's son. Cyrus is the one that conquered the Babylonians and allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem if they wanted to, and sent Ezra and Nehemiah back to the land of Israel. So,
right, and strikingly not mentioned here, right? Sort of wild, like that. This big historical event, according to the rest of the Tanakh, is going on, and Esther and Mordechai are totally oblivious. Were there others, Ed?
It says that Xerxes reigned from 486 to 465 BC, about 20 years.
Right. Right. So that like so the uh the Jewish Study Bible brings good data on all of that. It also mentions that there's a Greek version which you can find in like full Christian Bibles. It's in the Apocrypha, just before the book of after Judith. I know some of you studied Judith with Rabbi Sisi, or a bit of it, and before Maccabees, and it's like it's almost like it's already doing midrash on Esther, or again like fan fiction or the DVD extended director's extended cut, Godfather 3 version, right? Like sort of like this. It corrects the theological errors of the Book of Esther, meaning it mentions God a lot. It makes sure that all the characters pray. And it gives Esther a voice that she's unhappy to be like stuck in this relationship with this buffoonish king. So we won't spend much time with that, but like all of those theological mistakes are in the sort of like Greek additional versions that you can find in the Apocrypha. The they as tends to be the case, I think, like it's safe to say one can ask that, like, which version is correct? Like, is the version that exists in the Hebrew Bible correct, or the additions in the Greek version correct? And I think the Hebrew Bible comes out in because whenever you have two competing sources, and it's hard to know like which one is sort of like the first or the authentic or whatever term you want to use, like a good rule of thumb is which one would somebody which is the one that's in the interest of somebody to change. So obviously what we would expect out of the Bible is mentions of God, people praying, and certainly for a later biblical book, Jews uncomfortable with marrying non-Jews, right? So those are the things that you would expect. So, and you wouldn't purposefully want a book that, doesn't have those, that is on the wrong side of those things. So it must be that the version with the wrong side's got to be the original one, because it's against the interest of the editors of the Tanakh to have that. So if it's there and it's against their interest to have it, must be because that's the real, they think, well, that's the real thing. By the way, you can apply that to current debates as well. All of that, there's a ton here. What Ed said is exactly right. The Esther, when we get to her, we'll mention, obviously, she walks around like many of us do with a Hebrew name and a name in the vernacular to pass in the larger society, right? So, you can have different names inside and outside, as it were. And Mordechai sort of has similar naming issues. Xerxes is is presumed to be the king that is called Achashverosh. In the as the JSB notes that Ed was citing, notes in the Greek version it calls him Anaxerxes, slightly later, but again probably incorrect to be the later version. And it takes place in a town that is real. Shushan is Susa, which is still on the Iranian-Iraqi border, sort of like a third of the way up, maybe less, from if you just go up from like Kuwait and Basra and like that sort of there's a town called Susa that to this day has a shrine, like a tomb of Esther and Mordecai, that back in the day when Jews were in before the Islamic Republic of Iran and before the state of Israel, like were able to visit. We are not planning a shul trip to the to Iran, to the original site, but you know, who knows what the future will bring. So it's like a real place. And again, to the tradition, it really happened. And to the, you know, and so traditionally, this is a historical story. I don't think it is. Like, it doesn't seem like it's real. And I don't think it's trying to be a real story, meaning that I'm of the opinion, and I say this each year, I think the original audience knew it was a joke. And it reads like a joke to me. And it reads like it's it reads like it's a parody of the Persian court. So this is closer to being political satire, to being a, you know, a Saturday Night Live sketch, as it were, than it is a historical reporting. So when the tradition, you know, the Art Scroll gang reads it as fact, it's, to me, it's almost as if like some future generation comes across a Saturday Night Live sketch of Trump or Obama or Bush or Clinton or whoever you want it to be of, like the and thinks that it's real. Insert your own joke here about, you know, that we've crossed over from from what we think would be parody into reality and all that stuff. But like, I think it actually is designed as parody and was obviously that, and that the tradition doesn't do itself any great service by acting like these are historical events that actually happened. Pause. Others?
So I take that to mean that there is no known historical story at that time of the Jewish people possibly being, you know, all killed off.
Correct. I spilled water. Do I have napkins? I think I do. This is what I get for not having a cup with a lid. Hold on, I need something to sop up. No, there is not. There is not. And if anything, like sort of like alter, like sort of like things to the contrary. That's almost like part of the joke. That is that the Persians, actually this builds on something that Ed like brought up, were like known to be chilled out with their minorities, so to speak, mean that they were that they were tolerant or comparatively tolerant towards religious and ethnic minorities. And in fact, we all know this because it was the Persians who overthrew the Babylonians and said, you can go back home and rebuild the temple. And if we stick with the timeline or the proposed timeline, like, you know, if Ahasuerus is Xerxes and Cyrus's son or grandson, doesn't even matter, like what, like he's not like turning around that fast. Like it didn't go like in 1 or 2 generations, though it can. We read the story of Pharaoh not knowing Joseph and such, like, but no, they were good with it. So there's no record of anything like that. No record of a attempted genocide. No record of a law that that once, you know, the king's signature is on it, that it can't be revoked. Like that stuff doesn't seem to be real. So that also could be part of the joke, that meaning that the Persians were sort of like if anyone's going to like have a decree to kill the Jews, they weren't good candidates for it. So that's part of it, and there's no record of Esther, right? Not necessarily that there would be, and that sense that that a small Jewish minority would, the end of the book is them rising up and killing a large majority population, also seems, somewhat fanciful. Yeah, so we'll go through as we go through the story. We'll see why all of this is, but I actually think it's there, as it were, meaning that that you'll see all of this. Others? Well, then we get to dive in. There's still a lot, and there's still a lot, like, sort of by way of introduction, but all of that can go through as we do it, as we read the text. I didn't grab the Hebrew, but I think I grab the Hebrew.
Rabbi, can I ask one question?
Sure.
So, I mean, we talked about the fact that this was basically, it was a mixed marriage. And so at that time, that was not, I'm sure that was frowned upon.
Yes, we've turned the corner on that stuff, meaning that from biblical times, when it didn't matter, by this point in history, it did.
And so we don't see her being, we don't see her being criticized for that. But is that perhaps because in retrospect, she winds up saving the Jews from the existential threat? So
yes, but that's part of what's great. Yeah, so yes, that's like a yes and so that I think that is the case. And by the way, when I say that by this point it is a problem, it's almost specifically at this point. It's Ezra. Ezra is the one who comes down the hardest, and maybe the hardest of anyone in Jewish history, certainly up until that point, and maybe even since, on exogamy, on marrying out, and so that's part of what's wild about it, is that concurrently with Ezra's decree, there's a scene in Ezra where he makes everyone divorce their non-Jewish wives. So not only is it disapproved of, but there's a decree mandating divorce. So super extreme. And this, where it's the intermarried individual that saves the Jews, partly because she's intermarried. So yeah, that also is a rich, it's a rich part of the story. Yeah. Yeah, so she's not criticized maybe for that reason, but also that, but that just underlines the part of the highlights the issue. So, all right, we said, look at this. We're actually getting to text. So it begins. And if you, if you know, and some of you do, Megillah trope, it's even, Megillah is traditionally read in a unique cantillation that is, even feels like a fairy tale, which I feel like is, again, not accidental. And it happened in the days of Achashverosh, the Achashverosh, who is king from India to Kush, 127 provinces, right? So the Hodu, here, India, probably the Indus Valley, in what's now Pakistan, is all India before the British left. To Kush, which is Nubia, Ethiopia, we think now like south of Egypt. So this is a sense of the extent of the Persian Empire from so much of the known and settled world sort of to them. If you think of Europe as still a backwater and the Americas as a totally separately developing human society like Australia, and the Far East as sort of a less totally separate but separate sort of corner of the world. To the authors, this is an empire that stretches through much of what the known world is to them. Sub-Saharan Africa being not necessarily part of their consciousness, like so this have it is Ahasuerus, who's king from India to Kush, this massive empire, 127 provinces. Numbers are part of what the text will like to do. It will like to be to throw out a lot of precise numbers. And in those days, when Ahasuerus was seated on his royal throne, which was in Shushan, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a great banquet in the presence for all his ministers and servants, the freeholders. Do we get to use it after January 1st? The freeholders of Persia and Media, the noblemen and ministers of the provinces, when he showed the wealth of his kingdom's glory and the worth of his splendor, of his greatness of many days, 180 days, period. Run-on sentence, also typical of this book. Unlike other books of the Tanakh, which will often have a terse and somewhat staccato style, the Hebrew of Esther will have these sort of weird run-on sentences like that. For freeholders, Alter notes that the Hebrew term chayil means military force, but also refers to wealth, as in Ruth. She was called Eshet Chayil, and the latter meaning is more likely here, he thinks. So this is part of like the bodiness of the story, right? Like the story begins with a glimpse of the royal court. And what's the story with the royal court? The royal court is one where the wealth of his kingdom's glory and the worth of the splendor of his greatness is on display at this huge feast. And the feast lasts 180 days. A 6-month party. That's part of like the ridiculousness of it, right? Like there's nothing. This is a king who will be, this king will be fascinated with women. He'll be interested in partying. He will be sort of like easily swayed by the last advisor to speak with him. He will be not seemingly focused on his duties and constantly surprised by what's going on. The king is portrayed as a buffoon, and that's and serious only about unserious things. The word, by the way, for banquet here, Malko asa mishteh. It's not just a banquet; it's a mishteh. It's like a drinking banquet. The same. So again, there's a sense of something wild going on here. Pause. We good? 180 days. As Alter notes, The lavish banquet for the royal bureaucracy goes on for approximately half a solar year. This does not seem to be an empire in which much business gets done, right? Like that seems to be part of the joke. And when these days had gone by, the king made a banquet for all the people who were in Shushan, the capital, from the greatest to the least, a 7-day banquet in the garden court of the king's pavilion. White linen, indigo cotton, fastened with cords of fine crimson cloth on silver cylinders and marble columns, gold and silver couches on a paving of alabaster and marble, and mother of pearl and black pearl. Again, a run-on sentence. Again, this sort of like lavish detail, and a kingdom in which not a whole lot of work is getting done. Right? This is after a 6-month party, the king decrees a 7-day party. There's the business of state for this massive empire like isn't getting a lot of attention, it would seem. The difference being the first one was for the elites of society, and this second party is for all of the people in Shushan, the capital, from old to young. Mishteh, again, this word that for party or banquet that suggests drinking. So there's a general sense of drunkenness throughout, and that will and that feeds the link of drinking on Purim to drinking in the text. Though part of the problematic piece of it is that the drinking in the text seems to not lead anywhere good.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Little Kabbalah. What do the numbers 127 or 180 or 7 mean? I'm sure they've been interpreted.
I off the top of my head, I mean, 7 is easy, right? Like 7 is one of our central numbers. For 127 or 180, the 180 could just be the like half a year, right? Or about half a year, 6 months. But I don't know. I have
letters that represent them don't spell out the name of.
I spend so much. I don't know off the top of my head. Let's see. So let me just check some of the sources. So one piece from the Talmud says, why does it say both? You know, like why does it say, you know, from India to Hodu ad Kush, from India to Nubia or to Ethiopia, Kush, however you want to translate it. Then why do you say 127 provinces? Like you could have said one, or you could have said the other. Why are you saying both? It said to tell you that from the beginning, B'tichila melech al Sheva. In the beginning, he was only king over 7. It was Sof melech al Esrim. And in the end, it says it was Sof twice. In the end, he was king over 20. It was Sof melech al Mea. And again in the end, he was king over 100. So that one isn't clear to me. Saying of anything else? So yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head. Yeah, I don't have an answer, but I'll check. I'm sure somebody has something, but it ain't me. Though there is in general here a fascination with numbers. Again, like you'll see sort of a The author will seem fixed on these little details, and you see that in the like descriptions of like the lavish palace that you see in verse 5, 6. The luxury is dwelled upon. 7. This is where we get to the things that the king is serious about. The hashkot b'klei zahav v'kleim v'kleim shonim v'yayin malchut rav kiyad melech. And drink was proffered in golden vessels and vessels of various kinds, an abundant royal wine in kingly fashion. The tradition, one sort of like strand of the tradition wants to make Ahasuerus out to be even worse than he comes off as in the text. So he says that when it says that these are golden vessels, these aren't just any golden vessels. These are the golden vessels. These are the golden vessels that, remember, the Babylonians conquer the temple and loot it. They took all of the gold and all the golden vessels from the temple and brought it to Babylon. The Persians conquer Babylon and take all of their gold. So when the king is sitting around drinking out of royal vessels, this is the very gold. This is the very gold that was stolen from the temple. How bad, how bad is Ahasuerus? Not only is he the kind of king who just sits around drinking all year, instead of ruling his kingdom, but they're drinking at this what we'll see is sort of this body ball in out of temple utensils. And then verse 8, another one of the great verses.
Rabbi,
sir.
Just historical context about Xerxes. This says in the 3rd year of his reign, which would be 483 BC. But in 480 BC was the Battle of Thermopylae against the Greeks. So it's sort of like he might have been doing nothing, but he sent like 300,000 men against Athens, against Greece.
Right. And I think, and again, like that's the like non-historical nature of the text. So yes, and the original audience like may have sort of like been aware of that sort of thing, and that's why this is I think like partly like closer to ancient Saturday Night Live sketch, so where something is exaggerated, right? Gerald Ford might have tripped every so often, but not to the extent that Chevy Chase portrays it, right? So instead of being a competent ruler who faces off against mighty empires in battle, he's a drunken idiot. Yeah. This is where we'll end up. Vashtiya kadata enones kikeni esod melch al kol rav veto la'asod karatzon ish vaish. And the drinking was according to royal rule. There was no compulsion. For thus had the king decreed to all the officials in his house, let every man act according to his will. So the rule was for drinking was no rules. Drink or don't drink. Drink as much as you like or don't drink as much as you like. Which is weird. Like again, like the word rule will come up later on, but like this is a thing. Like the rule is no rules, and somehow like there's a it has to be mentioned that way. So again, there's a bizarre focus on what seems unimportant in the book from the start, and we're like a number of lines in, and we're used to biblical books focusing on either God-related matters or affairs of state, as it were. This is going to be focused on different affairs of state. Like this, it's not going to be focused on like sort of like wars or the temple. It's focused here. We're focused on something totally different. Massive parties. Alan in the chat mentions that 127 is also the years of Sarah's life. Good, and for Sarah's life, it's mentioned the same way. Where instead of just saying 127, it's like 7 and 20 and 100. We should pause there. It all seems to be a silly way to lead up to what's going to be a violent story. I'll pause. Other thoughts before we move on? We'll continue next week and work our way through. Again, as for all the things that go on in our world, please take care of yourselves. It was pushed down the news cycle yesterday, but yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, was the most deadly day of the where the most deaths were recorded of the pandemic yet. So Somerset County is doing better than many, but it's worth being careful and as always, remembering our obligations to each other, because the society doesn't function when we don't.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good